All right. Questions about projects? I've met with a couple of you um, independently. Do we have? I mean, you and I can talk like afterwards. You want if I can? I'll give you the pitch for the whole thing. But do we have specific questions about um, project ideas that you have, or want me to push you in the right direction? What's the scoop? Go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about helping my church with their Sunday school program because we have uh, we have a large Sunday school we group first through fifth together, and they're all in the same room, and so they have this sort of check-in system, but they don't have a check-out system. And I was wondering if that could be the scope, of me trying to help them set up or working on the check-out system.
Okay, so how would like a checkout system work? How does their check-in system work right now?
Well, they have the check-in system is you go up to the front desk or like the welcome center, and you get the child gets a name tag, and then uh, you have a barcode that you're supposed to scan when you send them in to the school or in the Sunday school, and then all they do is they check your numbers, and I was wondering if I could make that more efficient by using sort of a scan out program.
Okay, and I assume like this barcode's like tattooed on the kid's face.
It's on the name tag.
Oh, so it's something they can. Oh, I don't know. Why did I assume it was tattooed on their face? It's either or. You either put it on a removable sticker or make it a permanent. Yeah. All right. So they're already scanning them in. So now you're looking at what should they do, like when like the parents come pick them up,
Yeah.
type thing, because at the end of the day they're kind of out of kids, but they don't necessarily know that all the kids were picked up by parents, type thing.
They have the barcodes or they have numbers that they're supposed to check that are on both the parents. They have a little sort of like a slip that they have, and then the kids have the number on their barcode, and all they do is they check that.
Like visually.
Yeah.
They visually check that to find out if you're allowed to give this kid to that person.
Yeah.
Because sometimes like grandma would show up and they happen to have the thing, so they're allowed to pick up the kid. But they're not really marking that kid as having left.
Yeah.
They're just kind of sweeping the room, seeing are we out of kids to hand back. And once the answer is probably yes, because you don't know if they're hiding somewhere or something like that, then they shut the building down and possibly lock the kids inside. So you want to really make sure your list goes down to 0. Okay, so what did you have in mind as a checkout process?
Sort of, using what they have since I have the IT major, using what they have and sort of implementing it as like a database or an array, so you're able to, when the information comes in, you can get it out instead of having to go through the security process.
Okay, so they already have a mechanism in place where the kids scan in. So that's getting recorded somewhere. Do you know how that's working? Okay, so one thing is going to be a matter of kind of understanding what their current system looks like. Is that actually a piece of software that they're using that does that, or is it just a scanning program that dumps it into like a spreadsheet? What's the nature of that whole check-in process? Because what you might look at doing is replacing their entire current process with basically a single system. Check in, check out. I'm sure there's probably existing software to do this. They might even have existing software. They're just only using half of it. So part of it's going to be about learning kind of what they already have, what software exists out there for either upgrading it or augmenting it or whatever. But ultimately, you're looking at taking what they currently have and making it better. So not necessarily just making a checkout system, because that checkout system needs to be compatible with what they already have. So it might also mean that you need to replace their check-in system or change their check-in system or something like that. So my initial gut feeling is that since they already are scanning stuff, they already have a check-in system, just implementing a checkout system might not be a large enough scope.
So if I do the whole thing together,
Either do the whole thing or really look at what they currently have, what they could have, and really implement a complete system where there might be, it can generate reports for attendance and things like that. So
they also have with the numbers that the kid has on the name tag, they send that into the auditorium where, for lack of a better term, like service big churches, and so they send that over there because if they have problems with kids, then they notify the parents on the PowerPoints or like on the projectors, and they just flash the kids' numbers. And so I like.
So it's kind of like bingo.
Pretty much.
So you're like in the middle of like a church service,
Yeah.
and then all of a sudden like BH. So mom gets up, it's like the kid's out of line. Really?
Whose kid is gonna have a meltdown?
It's kind of awesome.
Well, because like this for the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, they have sort of like a nursery kind of thing where they have 2 students maybe in there that are watching the kids, and then if the kids are getting out of hand, they go report it, and then they flash it over the PowerPoint.
It's kind of like Hunger Games style, where like once one of the contestants got killed off, they showed it up on like the sky, like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think your first step, which obviously you want to do as soon as possible, is get with because I assume this church is back in Michigan.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
Yeah, I'm with the youth minister and all that.
Right. So get with them to figure out what their current system actually is, what it actually does, and how it does it, and then use that as your kind of base point to figure out, okay, well, if I'm going to either augment or I'm going to replace that system, what features do I need to add to make it a big enough scope? Is it, maybe so fine, you've started off with, okay, we need a checkout process. Fine, but what other data are we capturing then? What about generating reports? Where at the end of the year, how many came in, how many came out, what was attendance on an individual person's basis, maybe even like for lack of a better phrase, a review process where based on behavior of these kids, like you said, that they can go and report something to somebody, maybe that automate that where they can go in and put the big unhappy face, they just push the button like McDonald's style, and all of a sudden the kid pops up on the PowerPoint and mom has to come and get them, or whatever. Kind of take the current process and upgrade it, but figure out what they currently have so that you know how much work it's going to take to make it more, and then try to fit that into that 300-hour kind of mold. But I think that could work as long as you get an understanding of the current problem, that current solution, what they're missing, what they'd like to have, and then you might have to make up some stuff. Make up reports that whether they really want them or not, maybe they have them. Whether they want to run them or not, or whether it's actually that useful to them, they have the ability to run those, and you give them that reporting ability where they can generate basic different statistics based on attendance and that kind of stuff. That make sense?
Yeah.
All right. What else? Go ahead.
For the idea paper, how developed does our idea have to be? Because what if your client is still trying to figure out some of the details of the project?
Well, yeah. So I would say develop along the lines. So him and I just had this conversation about his project. So at the end of the day, he's probably not going to have all the requirements for his project by next Tuesday, right? It's just not going to happen. But by the next Tuesday after that, when the requirements document is due, they have to be in there. So you basically have a week and a half to get that requirements list. So you have until Tuesday to get the bigger gist. So he's going to have a conversation with the youth minister at the church and kind of get an idea what the current thing is. And he's going to put that into a document, effectively pitching like, I'm going to do a project along the lines of this. They already have a check-in process. I want to have a checkout process. And then we're looking at upgrading the whole thing and do some of these things. And we're going to be, the specific requirements will be in the requirements document, but kind of pitching the general idea is what that.
So it doesn't need to be super fleshed out. It won't be
Correct. It shouldn't be. That's something. I mean, if it is, that's great. That means you're ahead of the game. But that also means now you already have a good starter content for your requirements document. That requirements document is really where things are fleshed out. Make sense? Yep.
So it helps with our idea paper we release met once with our client already, right?
Well, at the very least, you should have a conversation with the client to make sure that you're both on the same page, whether that's meeting with them in person or a phone call or at least some back and forth emails, something along those lines, so that what you're intending on doing is compatible or in line with what they expect you to do. The real litmus test for that's going to be that requirements document, because ultimately that requirements document is going to be like I said, not just a contract between you and I, but a contract between you and the client. So I'm going to look at your requirements document as is this big enough, a big enough scope? Your client is going to look at the requirements document and say, does this do what I want it to do? Now, if there's some contradictory stuff in there where it doesn't do, let's say I say, yeah, this is plenty of work, and your client says, well, this does some of what I want, but I actually want it to do more. Well, then at some point there, you're going to have to say, well, for my project, I'm going to do this part. Because doing more is outside the scope of what I can do in a semester. Now, maybe you divide the project up into 2 phases. Maybe you do the phase for the semester where it meets the requirements for your senior seminar project, and then maybe they hire you after the fact to do part 2 of the project and keep going with it, or something like that. So you can plan out to do more, but at some point, effectively, you're promising me about 300 hours of work, and hopefully the work that fits into those 300 hours is compatible with at least some of what your client wants. That make sense?
Yeah.
What else? Go ahead.
I guess I was kind of talking with Josh Locklear about doing something with the HoloLens.
Yep.
But I guess we don't really have a complete idea yet. We're meeting on Monday about it.
Okay.
Would you have any ideas that could possibly?
Not like necessarily off the top of my head, other than I think it would be really cool to do something with the HoloLens. So I think that would be a good project in general to do some practical thing with the HoloLens, even if it is something that's less about solving a problem and more like proof of concept. Like, here are some things that you could do with this, almost as like a legitimate demonstration of the HoloLens, that type of thing. Yeah. And I think there's value in doing something with the HoloLens. So I guess I'd encourage you to go down that path. And I'm sure that between you and him, you'll figure out something that seems reasonable. But I think that would be cool. What else? Go ahead.
So a few years ago, SGA paid somebody to build an app for them.
Okay.
Hopefully nobody hears close with that person, because in the end it turns out it's terrible. It was supposed to be for internal usage. It barely does anything. It's like if you went into, what is the Android designer, whatever it is, and like drag and drop a few things, and then say, hey, here you go. So I talked with the exec board, and we're hoping that I can build something that we can use both internally and externally to link to students. They'll have all of our internal documents, so the resolutions come up, everybody can see them right away. Groups net for the committees, push notifications for committee members, or if something really big happens for students, calendar of our events. Hopefully just one central area to get everything together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking probably run it all off the server. I mean, the server and Raspberry Pi just for fun now, and then have a mobile and PC interface for it.
Okay, so you're looking at when you say mobile interface, is it going to be mobile web, or is it going to be native Android or iOS?
I would like to make it native to both. I don't know if that's too big of a scope.
Okay, well, so maybe the scope is let's really flesh it out for one, and then if they want to hire you to do part 2 of it for for maybe you do Android first, then you do iOS later, or maybe what you do is you do it initially on a cross-platform type tool like Appcelerator or Xamarin. What's the other one? Well, there's cross-platform development tools where you effectively have one code base, and then it deploys to iOS, to Android, to Windows Mobile, to BlackBerry, to all of them. So when you use a cross-platform tool like that, you do give yourself some limitations. You effectively are playing to the lowest common denominator across all those devices, because when the latest, greatest version of iOS comes out, it can do 2 things that Android can't do, and then when Android comes out, the new version, it can do 2 things that iOS can't do. So you're playing to your lowest common denominator across the minimum versions across the platform. But for something like SGA, it's much more about utilitarianism than it is about bells and whistles and stuff like that. So that might be a reasonable reasonable reason to use a cross-platform tool, because you're not trying. It's not going to be flashy. It doesn't mean that cross-platform versions of apps look like crap. It just means that you lose some of your flexibility. So that might be okay. So then you could really target both iOS and Android, and accidentally you're targeting Windows Mobile, and because you're doing it all with this cross-platform tool. So you might look into that, whether or not you want to write this native or you want to write it with a cross-platform tool. The main tool that comes to mind, that at least the last time I looked into it, which this is probably dated about 6 months, so there very likely are new players since then. But Xamarin, 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 is that right? Something like that. It's a .NET technology. So you would use like Visual Studio to do it, and it deploys to, in order to actually deploy it to iOS, you need to then have a Mac because it creates an Xcode project and stuff. But the point is that you write it using C#, that kind of stuff, .NET-y stuff, and it then deploys to all the different platforms. So that looked very promising when I looked at it 6 months ago. Something to consider, and look at maybe a good Google search would be Xamarin competitors. Because another one was like Appcelerator, but that one's been around for a while. And then the other one that's, I'm forgetting, is there's another PhoneGap. PhoneGap is the one I'm looking for. So PhoneGap's approach is they have basically an app player for iOS, an app player for Android, an app player for Windows. So you download that as your core of your app, and then you write your application in effectively HTML5. You drop it into the PhoneGap player for those different things, and it plays your app on that device.
Okay.
That's one approach. The Appcelerator approach actually deploys to projects. So it creates an Xcode project, it creates an Android project, that kind of stuff. And Xamarin works similar to that.
Okay.
I just know when I looked at it 6 months ago or so, Xamarin looked like they were making kind of professional moves forward as opposed to kind of, hobbyist type stuff. So worth looking at. In terms of database backend stuff, I would definitely look at Firebase, which is a Google technology. Firebase.google.com, I think, takes you there. It's a real-time database. It'll make push notifications way easier than they will be otherwise. I know quite a bit about Firebase. Dover also knows quite a bit about Firebase. Josh knows quite a bit about Firebase. Have you worked with Firebase or just Parse? You worked with Parse though, right? Okay. But in any case, Firebase is kind of the current cool kid for real-time databases. So if you're going to do push notification stuff and you're going to do maybe chat-based stuff, something we had talked about in some of the previous classes, I don't remember which class we did it in, but 450, we were talking about a chat server, right? And how chat servers are kind of funny from the perspective of you look at them, and you and I were just talking about this morning. You look at them and you assume, oh, it's a chat server, that must be easy. They're actually way more complex than they should be to write. Well, they're actually super simple to do with Firebase. Because since Firebase is a real-time database, if this guy posts a message, so let's say you have 10 people with apps, and all of these people's apps are all set up to be observers of this Firebase database. So whenever anything changes here, they all become notified. This guy here sends a message. It changes the database here. That message automatically pushes to all of these, and they automatically update without you having to do any sort of real magic, because you've set up an observer. So in some of the other classes, we've talked about like the observer design pattern. So Firebase has built into it the observer design pattern. You can do some really cool stuff with Firebase, and it makes you look like a pro without you actually having to do that much work. It's kind of the punchline. So I guess at the end of the day, doing something for SGA, as long as the scope was reasonable in size, I think it could be a cool thing. One thing I would be pretty interested in from that perspective is I've never really worked with cross-platform tools. I know quite a bit about them externally, but I've never actually, maybe got up the guts to actually use one, because I'm pretty proficient in just doing them natively. And so why charge once when I can charge twice? But that doesn't mean that that's not the right tool for the job more times than I allow it to be out of my own ignorance. So I'd also be interested in kind of you may be using a cross-platform tool, which very well might be a good solution for that, since you want to reach a bigger audience. and your app isn't doing anything earth-shattering, that might be a good opportunity to do that. So I would look at some of the complexity hours being kind of getting up to speed on that cross-platform tool, and maybe even part of your deliverable being almost like a tutorial for getting into it. So which maybe would allow you to get away with a few less features on the app, because half your project is kind of a almost like cross-platform tool tutorial for maybe that I can go through, and then maybe have some students go through as well. I don't know about, in terms of feature list, how big the SGA app feature list would end up being, but what I'm getting at is if you need some wiggle room, if those features are kind of limited, then you could maybe build up the tutorial side of things so you can learn about the cross-platform tool and then benefit the department by kind of giving us 2 or 3 labs to take students through or something.
Sure.
So something for you to kick around.
Sure.
Make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what you're saying.
Okay. But I'm not requiring you to use a cross-platform tool. If you end up deciding, hey, I want to do this in Android, that's fine. I'm just saying I think it would be cool and to do cross-platform. It would be something that would be of interest to me.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean you have to do it. So look into it, because it's a horrible option.
Okay.
Yeah. I've always just done native, but I've run software companies and I like charging people money. So it's plus you got the whole Jewish thing. So I switched to the bacon and the Christianity, but the deal making stuff, it's in the blood. It's unfortunately that's more true than it should be, actually. All right, what else? Go ahead.
I was thinking on either updating or somewhat creating more updated version of the website for my church. They have a website right now, but it's probably like worth it when the internet started.
Okay.
It's like so old, it's like $5,000 text basically.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking either looking into that and seeing what the back end of that looks like, or using something with WordPress and making a new one and then having where they can upload audio files to the website or
Okay.
video.
Now, are you IT or CS? IT, okay. So that would be fine. So you'd be, if you went with like a Word, the advantage of something like a WordPress would be that it's going to be easier for them to manage content updates. So effectively what you would be creating for them is you could be creating the initial website. So part of that's going to be taking existing tools like WordPress and various plugins and stuff like that, getting them all set up so they're all working and things like that, having your audio or video player thing set up in there so people can watch, or listen to, streaming sermons or, that kind of stuff. But then also creating documentation for people at the church to put announcements out there and that kind of stuff. One thing that I would look for with that kind of pitch would be what those requirements are for the website, because one thing you want to keep in mind is that most websites are not overly complex unless they're like e-commerce sites. Well, so a church isn't necessarily an e-commerce site, but one thing you might have is you might have an interactive prayer list or something like that, where people can put in a request for prayers that then goes to like some sort of administrator who can then, approve, or, because you don't want people to like be able to drop an F-bomb as the prayer request or something like that, because then they're just screwing with you. But, something like that where there's some interactive nature, but some features to the website as opposed to just being a homepage with a picture of the church. You get what I'm saying? So really think about functionality of the church married with the documentation and training that you would provide to the folks of the church for using this. And then I would just encourage you to really think about the features from the perspective of it needs to be more than just a dumb little website. It should have something, at least one aspect of it, or maybe a couple of aspects of it that are kind of examples of automation or real-time communication, whether it's live streaming of a sermon or something like that, or if it's creating playlists of sermons, whatever, something like that. That's beyond just the boring, mundane website. Make some sense? Okay. What else? That's it.
I kind of expanded on my original idea.
Okay. Hit me with it.
Doing some kind of data analysis project that I found a lot of resources online
that would allow that I could learn how to basically collect data from, I don't know, the CUW Twitter account and kind of collect all that data, sort out all the terms and kind of get a basis of how do I put it? Basically you get a kind of feel of how are we presenting ourselves through social media, kind of comparing our different social media accounts, doing a sentiment analysis, where we kind of present ourselves well or bad, kind of what terms do we use more often, kind of getting maybe presenting this information visually.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be kind of an interesting project.
Okay. One thing I would maybe encourage you to do, and you might be able to catch him right after class. I think I saw him walk by. You might go in and at least have a couple-minute conversation with Dr. Locklear. It might lead nowhere. But at our meeting today at lunch, he was mentioning something about an analytics minor that we might be looking at, which would, effectively it's data science stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe get his idea of what's going around in his mind about that, because maybe there's some connection we can do kind of along the lines of what you're interested in and maybe what he was kind of thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
That might augment your idea, replace maybe instead of looking at social media stuff, maybe it's something that he kind of had in mind. At the very least, it's probably worth a short conversation just to see if there was something that he was interested in, since you seem to be interested in that topic.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what you said there is fine. You know, but since I think he's in there, it might be worth a couple of minutes just to see if what the motivation was behind that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. What else? Going once. Going twice. All right, so we're all going to have our idea papers in before class starts on Tuesday, and then we'll talk about the requirements document. You already have some documentation for the requirements document up there, so if you want to get an early start, feel free. Remember, we talked about the requirements document last time. Its purpose is to unambiguously and in great detail show all the requirements that the project should meet. Make sense? All right, I will see everybody on Tuesday. And Dover, you're going to hang out for a few?
What's that?